We might get started. So hello and welcome to this session of the virtual day for the 4th International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wongal people of the Eora Nation from whose lands I am joining you today. I extend my respect to any Indigenous peoples with us today, and I think this is important. Much of our conversation today centres on enduring connections to and struggles over land, struggles our Indigenous colleagues know all too well. We stand in solidarity with them and for all those who are fighting for justice worldwide. My name is Tom Kavanagh. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and I'm also the co-chair of the Forest Interest Group at the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. I'm really excited to be with you for what promises to be a fascinating session titled Mobility Dimensions of Climate Change, Land Grabbing and UN Interventions. Just a few housekeeping notes. We have 4 presentations today, so we're going to hold all the questions until the end to give everyone a chance to present. If you have any questions for the speakers as the presentations are going on, please drop it in the chat or use the Q&A function, and I'll put it to them during the discussion portion of today's session. With that, I'm going to very quickly hand over to our first speakers, Marie Steger and Azra Tinovic from the International Rescue Committee. Marie is an applied behavioural scientist with the IRC's Climate Research and Innovation team, where she works on climate resilience in displaced and conflict-affected communities. She's also a PhD researcher at the London School of Economics, focusing on climate adaptation and migration in agro-pastoral communities in South Sudan and Somalia. Over the past 4 years, she has worked at the nexus of behavioural science, climate and conflict with communities in northeast Syria, Yemen, Honduras, Somalia, South Sudan and Niger. Azra is the research and advocacy manager on the same team based at the IRC's Airable Impact Lab. Her work focuses on climate resilience and adaptation in fragile and conflict-affected settings, with a particular emphasis on bridging research and practice through action-oriented analysis, strategic foresight, conflict analysis, and systems thinking around climate security, adaptation, and livelihoods. She holds an MSc in environmental and water resources engineering from Tufts, and an MPhil in public and urban policy from the New School, where she is now a PhD candidate. Her doctoral research examines ecological violence and environmental justice in post-conflict settings. Today, they will be sharing their paper titled Uneven Paths of Mobility, Livelihood Practices, Agency and Migration Outcomes in Mudug, Somalia. Over to you, Marie and Azra.
Thank you so much for the intro. We're gonna sit next to each other and speak at the same time. And I will try and share my screen. Let me know when you can see it.
Perfect, thank you. Got it.
So thank you so much, Tom, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this lovely event for having us here, and to all the participants joining. So we'll be presenting on uneven paths of mobility, some of our recent work on livelihood practices, agency and mobility outcomes in fragile contexts, and we'll be looking at evidence from our recent work in Mudug, Somalia, where we spoke with 97 community members and stakeholders in October 2025. So just very quickly, an overview of some of the gaps that we're seeing in our work. So typically programming tends to assume one model of migration, whereas our data really shows many models. Most of the pastoralists with whom we spoke wish to stay, others wish to move but cannot, still others end up displaced under distress. And ultimately, those who move successfully are a very privileged subset. Yet almost always we find that mobility emerges as a last resort. So our design research asks what it would look like to provide support earlier, focusing on the pressures that actually drive mobility before it becomes the only option. Sorry. So a quick overview of the context in Mudug, Somalia. We find that compounding climate conflict and aid contraction are driving livelihood distress in this predominantly pastoral region. With respect to climate, 6 consecutive failed rainy seasons in Somalia have resulted in the worst drought in 4 decades, resulting in over 3 million livestock lost and over 1.3 million people displaced. Politically, Mudug is divided between Galmudug and Puntland, and we find that interclan disputes over water and pasture tend to intensify in the dry seasons, and overall traditional authority mechanisms are weakening in this region. All of this is compounded by the fact that the aid is simply contracting. So sharp reductions in humanitarian support since 2024, and especially since early 2025, have resulted basically in the dissolution of informal safety nets, as crisis is now becoming the norm rather than the exception. So overall, we see that climate and conflict are producing a vicious cycle of interclan and resource-related conflict. And this typically is triggered by scarcity, so resource scarcity, whereby, let's say, a drought depletes water and pasture. This pushes pastoralists to move further and across borders that they perhaps otherwise wouldn't have crossed, including clan borders and so forth. Ultimately, this drives conflict, renders mobility now riskier or in some instances blocked, traps herds on degraded pasture, and ultimately drives livelihood collapse as livestock losses become unviable. And overall, we find that our interlocutors are consistently framing drought rather than conflict itself as the primary driver of future insecurity, which is definitely notable. So the problem, the problem is that climate and conflict are reshaping mobility, but the outcomes themselves are deeply uneven, right? So programming typically treats migration as a single adaptive response, or perhaps a one-off discrete cost-benefit decision. Typically, programming assumes that movement signals adaptive capacity, that mobility is a preference, and that immobility is inertia, and that one migration response can therefore be applied to all. But this, of course, is a sizable gap with what we're actually seeing in the data and in practice, as our data shows that mobility emerges when livelihood practices break down. Again, most pastoralists actually want to stay. They don't wish to leave. Some who do want to move actually cannot. So these are trapped populations. And ultimately, mobility is producing multiple distinct outcomes and not just the one. And so ultimately, this matters because programming as it is now, tends to typically track movement and not the process, often missing who's trapped, who's being forced out. And therefore, we see that this one-size-fits-all approach to migration programming risks severe mismatch, as we believe that, of course, differentiated mobility outcomes require differential support. So we began to question what might be a better way to approach this problem.
So yeah, in order to find a better way to understanding the outcomes that, the differentiated mobility outcomes, we wanted to start looking at livelihood practices. So what are the things that people are already doing? So in this case, it's focused on pastoralism. And in order to understand livelihood practices, there's something called the social practice theory that helps us understand how materials, competencies, and meanings, these three elements, kind of interrelate and help us understand how they break down and then produce different mobility outcomes. So materials include things like livestock, so like camels and goats in this specific instance, water, pasture, roots, anything like physical. Then you have the embodied competencies of pastoralists. So for example, knowing when to sell parts of your herd, when to move, negotiating access to grazing and water. And then you have the meanings. So pastoral identity, the dignity that comes from this traditional livelihood practice. So by understanding these and seeing how they break down unevenly, we can understand these differentiated mobility outcomes. And also in our research, we've seen that agency is real, but really constrained. So when a practice functions, the action is kind of a routine, a habit. People know when to sell life, so people know when and where to move. But as practices become strained, this deliberation of not knowing what to do because, you don't really have this habituated answer anymore, becomes a problem. And then when the practice collapses, the deliberation continues, but viable options narrow and sometimes are gone. So we really need to shift this understanding from migration as one of single decision to seeing migration as a differentiated outcome by looking at practices and how they break down across these three elements. So when it comes to these findings that we've seen from Mooduk is then when livelihoods collapse, we really see mobility outcomes diverging. So the same shocks can really create different mobility outcomes. So as already mentioned, climate conflict and aid contraction really erode pastoral livelihoods. And it was really interesting to see that in our data, it breaks down unevenly across these three elements. So materials really collapse. People report like 50 to 100% of herd loss, and water access becoming really expensive. The routes, as we mentioned, are either blocked or they need to move really far. The competencies, interestingly, people really believe in their competency still of herding, but the conditions of where to apply them have really changed and don't really match anymore what they've learned through generations of how to handle drought, because it's not a new phenomena that drought exists. It's just that it's becoming increasingly difficult to apply those skills. And the most important one is that meanings persist. So the pastoral identity was strong across all of the people that we talked to. And there was a strong aspiration to return to pastoral life or continue with it. So most people actually do not want to leave. So it's often described as a last resort. People mentioning we were forced, we didn't have an option. These kinds of words were used a lot. And yeah, many displaced households still aspire to return to pastoralism, and the identity persists even after they've lost all of their livestock and they're, for example, in an IDP camp. So you can see that the same shocks really produce these distinct outcomes that are important to understand when we think about programming. And it ranges from adaptive mobility, where people are still able to do this traditional way of the livelihood practice, but they need to move further and need to have a truck to get to different grazing or water points, to fragmented livelihoods where a part of the family, for example, does some casual work to get some money to restock, to distress displacement from conflict or losing completely all of your livestock, to trapped immobility, where people were, for example, forced to move to an IDP camp, want to return, but they can't because of lacking resources, to a facilitated transition, where people might have friends or family that offer an opportunity in a city or a different location, and then they migrate. But it's important to understand that these outcomes depend on positionality. So they're shaped by gender, age, wealth, herd size, and the skills and the social networks that people have. And this successful transition, or like this facilitated transition, is more available for households with prior capital, mobility, social connections, and skills that are transferable. So we really need to understand the process, the why behind the different kinds of mobility through understanding meaning, competencies, and materials. And in order to do that, we need to work together with communities because they only understand their own realities and lived experiences. Through human-centered design, behavioral science, we need to co-design solutions together and match it to people, aspirations, and realities. And something that we need to keep in mind for any kind of programming that we're suggesting is that you can either maintain and defend the core livelihoods that we're trying to understand, nurture emerging livelihoods that are there, and strengthen the system around it. And just to give a very brief example that we're thinking about and how that maps into the framework, that's more about defending the core livelihood, is an ecosystem restoration idea where the community decides a certain part of the land that they want to fence off to kind of restore the grass and trees about like 6 months to get water and pasture to improve so they can continue to do pastoralism there. And the materials are restored, therefore the competencies are kind of reactivated, and the meanings are reinforced because we're not working against the pastoral identity, but really using, like the pastoral identity in this solution, and thinking about the community aspect here as well and social cohesion.
So ultimately, of course, the question really isn't whether people should move, it's whether the conditions exist for them to choose. So if we can stress 3 major takeaways here. Firstly, mobility is uneven. Again, most pastoralists that we spoke with want to stay, some want to move and can't. The ones that are able to successfully move are a privileged subset, but ultimately it's important to understand that programming that is aimed at only one of these groups really reaches the others poorly. So process is the missing data here, right? Typically programming tracks movements, but counting movements doesn't exactly tell you what to do. Whereas if we track livelihood practice breakdown, we can understand not only where the pressure is, but who is being forced out and who's being trapped. And ultimately, this allows us to focus on preventative rather than reactive action. We believe that to provide effective support, programming must work across the climate peace security nexus to reduce tensions over scarce resources while also expanding viable livelihood and mobility options, such that migration becomes a choice and not a last resort. So thank you so much for your attention and time, and we're here for any questions if you have them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marie and Astra. That was really fascinating, really important work. Thank you. Our next speaker today is Adam Savelli. Adam leads CGR's climate securities research in Asia Pacific and is a climate peace and mobility specialist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, where he focuses on climate-related mobility, natural resource management, and local adaptation. He's also a PhD candidate at Humboldt University of Berlin, and his research looks for technical entry points to improve impact across the humanitarian development peace nexus, while challenging traditional framings of how resilience emerges in places facing overlapping climate and security hazards. Adam is presenting two papers today, and the first is titled Climate-Related In-Situ Displacement. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Tom. Thank everyone else for joining. Thank you to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association for having us and for hosting this conference today. I just want to double check first that everyone can see my screen all right. Looks good?
Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Well, then, as Tom said, I'm Adam Savelli from the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, which is a CGIAR research center. I'm in New York City right now, but I'm normally based in Hanoi, Vietnam. And today I'm presenting about a paper that I wrote with my PhD supervisors, Michele Benace and Stefan Sieber, both from the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research and Humboldt University in Berlin. This presentation is based on a Viewpoint article that we recently published in Climate and Development, entitled Climate-Related In-Situ Displacement. And I'll begin by discussing the term in-situ displacement, which in itself is a paradox. If displacement means being forced from one space to another, how can it occur in situ while remaining in place? It raises a question, can one simultaneously be in and out of place? And that, of course, depends on how we determine what place is. Critical theorists argue that places emerge from human experiences with space, whereas spaces are empty. Places are socially constructed through human interaction with environments and communities. So based on this view, displacement can be cultural, emotional, environmental, political, or spatial, and often reflects a loss of one's sense of place more so than physical movement. The term in-situ displacement was coined in 2003 by Feldman, Geisler, and Silberling, and Feldman in particular went on to publish at length about this phenomenon. And it's been explored in anthropology and sociology, but largely ignored in environmental geography and mobility studies. It describes displacement experienced while staying in place, produced through exclusions that restrict physical or social movement. Our article highlights how climate-related environmental change can generate these forms of in-situ displacement. Both climate-related displacement and climate-related immobility can result from rapid onset disasters or slow onset hazards. Generally, the more vulnerable households are to extreme events, the less able they are to move, as mobility depends on wealth and social, economic, and political capital. Thus, climate-related in-situ displacement refers to the losses of those who remain in place while the climate-stressed socio-ecological systems they inhabit change faster than people can adapt. It refers to a climate-driven dislocation from the social-ecological systems that have traditionally sustained lives and livelihoods in a given place. Ecological grief, also termed solastalgia, offers an interesting entry point for understanding community impacts. And it's useful here because climate-related in-situ displacement is an emerging concept, let's say. Our paper has dealt with it, and there's been another fantastic paper by Julia Bella Bravo. But apart from these two papers, there isn't much in the literature that really does primary research on these phenomena. So ecological grief or solastalgia is a richer, more established discursive field that we can draw on here. And solastalgia or ecological grief encompasses emotional and mental health issues linked to climate change related losses, including the erosion of cultural practices, ecosystem degradation, loss of traditional knowledge, disempowerment in resource management, and pressures related to relocation. Among the Inuit of Canada, for example, melting sea ice increasingly prevents traditional practices such as long-distance migration and subsistence hunting, leading one person to note, it's challenging when you're living in a different lifestyle, but still living in the same area. For the Sami in Finland, warming winters and extreme weather, compounded by forestry, tourism, mining, and wind farming, threaten reindeer harming and salmon fishing, practices that are central to communal identity here. In Oceania, where planned relocation programs are expanding rapidly, indigenous peoples who express deep ontological connections to their land, terrestrial, and marine environments often resist leaving traditional homelands. As the president of the federal states of Micronesia put it in a speech at COP21, for indigenous communities, the loss of land, either due to climate-related environmental change or mass relocation, is akin to a genocide of oceanic cultures. Facing a choice between increasing climate risk or deep cultural losses, many prefer to remain in place. In Vanuatu, most at-risk households favor in-situ adaptation over relocation, with resettlement only seen as a last resort. A climate activist from Porto Vila explained, I would say I'm not going to move if there's a climate change event or impacts in my home, because, the place where I live is where I belong. Across these contexts, climate stresses intersect with indigenous cultural and political marginalization, threatening traditional ways of life and intensifying losses. Less dramatic and therefore less examined examples of climate-related in-situ displacement are likely manifesting in agricultural and aquacultural communities all around the world. Conversely, urban areas facing high rates of climate-related in-migration may rapidly experience change, leading to in-situ displacement of long-time residents. As such, research based on climate mobilities generally and climate-related immobility specifically is increasing. But framing the issue as climate-related in-situ displacement rather than involuntary immobility or trapped populations can help recenter the unequal power dynamics that drive and result from climate-related mobility or immobility. So, in summary, climate-related in-situ displacement shows how climate change can disrupt people's cultural, social, and political ties to a place without physical movement. Now, I know this seems primarily conceptual, but we think, the authors, that it presents a practical entry point for future research, policies, programming, and investments that we can seize on. So first, the concept directly links climate mobilities literature with other fields, including ecological loss. And it draws attention to really underexplored impacts of climate change and new and emerging forms of climate mobilities. Whereas mobility research often centers around risk indicators and aspiration capacity frameworks, climate-related in-situ displacement introduces a more relational, power-sensitive approach that shifts the focus from mobility to spatial relations, and hence centers the political positionality, of different social groups. Climate-related in-situ displacement identifies climate and environmental governance as central to experiences of displacement and immobility, reframing climate change as an actively produced output of capitalist spatial production rather than an apolitical, quantitative, or inevitable outcome. Similarly, climate-related in-situ displacement presents clear opportunities for inter and transdisciplinary research across bioclimatology, human geography, political ecology, environmental psychology, many other fields. Third, co-producing knowledge with climate-vulnerable communities can reveal power inequities while reaffirming local agency in negotiating mobility or immobility. Importantly, future research should amplify the voices of affected households and work toward the goal of mobility justice. Mobility justice is an overarching concept for thinking about how power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement, shaping the patterns of unequal mobility and immobility in the circulation of people, resources, and information. Climate-related in-situ displacement helps ground mobility justice within the context of ever-increasing anthropogenic climate change. Recognizing in-situ displacement also reframes how climate change erodes meaning, culture, and political participation tied to place, while highlighting emerging forms of placemaking and collective strategies for contesting climate injustices. In particular, participatory action research with those affected by climate-related in-situ displacement can illuminate novel means of community-led resistance and new forms of cultural production and political activity. This research can also identify indigenous strategies of resilience, self-determination, empowerment, and transformation that support in-situ adaptation and resist dispossession through community-led acts of anti-displacement and re-emplacement. Instead of being passively displaced, communities move to safer, rural, or remote regions to actively revitalize their indigenous cultures, homes, and livelihoods. And some of this was actually just discussed in different terms by Azra and Marie in Somalia. And here, I mean, there's a really nice paper by Carol Fabako, who's done amazing research in Tuvalu on anti-displacement, which is a process in which ideas, people, or matter become mobile in order to counter anticipated displacement materially or symbolically. She's also written about re-emplacement, which sort of is the other side of this coin, or the new ideas that people and/or matter and how they come together to remake a place ontologically, physically, emotionally, was previously deemed unsuitable for habitation. This is really a sense of reclaiming areas that have been deemed, unsuitable for habitation. And this new evidence that's co-produced with communities can then be used to strengthen the normative and legal bases for households or communities to exercise a right to stay and to counter the politicized narrative of inevitable climate-related displacement. Future research can also highlight gaps in current adaptation interventions that lack ontological coherence with indigenous worldviews, that discount the agency of the immobile, and it can also identify how external climate action, humanitarian development, or peacebuilding interventions can inadvertently drive maladaptation in these areas. Finally, and perhaps most optimistically, climate-related in-situ displacement may illuminate new dialectical spaces for contesting anthropogenic climate change. So by drawing attention to the increasing number of communities around the world who are failing to adapt to increasingly severe and unpredictable conditions, new political conditions, coalitions, might emerge. Though universal in scope, the impacts of climate change are classist, with the global working class bearing the brunt of its costs and reaping few of the profits. And so perhaps climate change, through its increasingly universal psychosocial displacement that it instills, will prove uniquely able to catalyze new forms of global political action. Let's see. And I will leave it there. We can come back to questions, I believe, at the end of the presentation. But thank you all.
Thank you, Adam. I love that optimistic note at the end, and fingers crossed. Our next speaker is Stephanie Zarama Alvarado. Sorry. Stephanie is a Colombian PhD candidate in development studies at the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn. Her dissertation focuses on environmental peace from below in the context of ongoing structural violence, extractivism, and colonial legacies in the Colombian Amazon. Today, Stephanie will be sharing her paper, Collective Memory, Migration, and Land Grabbing, Eco-Violence Escalating Conflict in Colombian Rural Communities of the San Juan Subregion. Over to you, Stephanie.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tom, for introducing me to the panel. I will share in this moment my presentation. So as all know, this panel is focused on the mobility dimensions of climate change, land grabbing, and interventions. In my case, my research is focused more in research extraction and mobility and displacement in the context of peace building settings. Specifically, I am working with an empirical case located in Colombia. As you know, Colombia has faced an armed conflict. In 2016, we observed the peace agreement signed by the government and one of the armed groups. There are still some other armed groups that actually playing a very strong role in the reactivation of the violence in these post-conflict settings. Therefore, my research case is focused in collective memory, migration, and land grabbing. Specifically, I would like to focus on how there is the eco-violence escalating the conflict in Colombian rural communities of the San Juan subregion of Chocó. So I will start showing here the specific territories that I could work. As you can see, Colombia has two oceans. We have the Caribbean Oceans, and we have also the Pacific Oceans. Chocó is one of the 32 departments that Colombia has. We can observe here in red color Chocó, and here in the dark green map, the different actually 30 municipalities that Chocó has. Specifically, my case study is focused in two communities located in two municipalities. Here you can see in red square indication, Condoto and Ismina. I will speak generally about Chocó, how Chocó has one of the world's richest deposits of gold, platinum, and timber. And also, of course, as you know, Colombia is one of the countries that is ranking as a most biodiversity countries in the world. We also know that this natural wealth has historically attracted extractive colonization at the expense of Afro-descendants and indigenous communities. And here I would like to clarify that the intention of analyzing ecoviolence as a possibility to see how is influencing actually the escalation of the conflict regarding the competition over natural resources as a one main mechanism that permit us to understand through analysis of a collective memory and how the past dispositions are reenacted in present day violence, trapping communities in cycles of displacement. Here, I wanted to show you in a general way, the Acoso community is located in the rural areas, so in the peripheries of the Condoto municipality. So here, I wanted to show you some image that I could have from that moment in when I was sharing with them. Here also the Basuri community, which is located in Ismina municipality. Finally, I would like to bring the general aspects regarding the different global assumptions that we have about land grabbing. We know that there is a paradox of recognition thanks of the most progressive constitutional land law in actually Latin America that we have in Colombia, which was established in 1991. And this put us the possibility to speak about the 8 million hectares that were disposed during the armed conflict. So now we can see how this progressive law doesn't prevent this extra economic coercion. So there is like a possibility of bringing all these kind of drivers of reactivation of the violence and, of course, the escalating of the eco-violence. So on that sense, I want to mention in a general aspect that from the global assumptions that we have, thanks actually with different scholars as Arango in 2025, that I think it was very relevant and interesting research in which tried to put the global assumption into a Colombian reality and express the necessity to look at the different actors, mechanisms, the land rush, the environmental impact, and the labor impact and policy solutions. So here we can observe how all these topics are currently playing a very strong role on that. Basically, I want to mention some of the aspects of the historical roots of the eco-violence in Chocó. Quickly, I will speak about how it emerged in 1959 with this communal logic and faucet communal land logic. Indigenous and Afro-descendants population inhabit territories harmoniously, but we can observe that after 1959 until 1960, there is a state-led disposition thanks to a law regarding forest reserves and different programs that favor private agro exploitation, foreigner mining companies. After that period of time, we observe arriving to 1917 to 1980 how the guerrilla or cartel groups and access to these territories in which these armed groups establish drug traffic corridors, cartels launder money through logging, castle ranching, and palm oil. After that, we see how from 1995 to 2006, there is a territorial terror thanks to the paramilitary groups. And on that sense, we can observe a massive displacement of all the Black, Indigenous, and Mestizo people from these territories, from these two communities that could face very strong problems regarding the armed conflict. Finally, in 2016, occurred the peace agreement in which we start analyzing the implementation of different peace policies programs. But of course, it's still in this moment facing very strong situations regarding that. But this research, actually the implementation of the research instruments was done in 2021, in which we can observe that the COVID-19 was a main issue here. So we try to implement these instruments like biographical narratives, interviews, and focus groups, which were in total applied to 47 individuals in between these two communities. This research design took into consideration the peace accord as a temporal axis, so before, during, and after. And so this established three general cohorts in which I could analyze by using Atlas T24 program. And here I would like to mention quickly how there are different frameworks that was important to take into consideration. One is the paradigm shift migration, so how the mobility bias trapped population and how the voluntary mobility permit to speak about the empowerment agents. Also, the Galton triangle of violence, in which we speak about direct, structural, and cultural violence. Also, the negative and positive piece by Galton, that I think is very important that we can keep that in mind. So the negative piece regarding the absence of violence, and positive piece, the presence of justice. I just wanted to briefly mention that into details how all these theoretical frameworks were taken into consideration. So for exploring the collective memory, was interesting to bring the social representation theory. So as we know, collective memory refers to the shared pools of memory and information associated with the group's identity. But the social representation theory, in that case, explains how groups actively build, circulate, and use this knowledge in every day. So these together, they demonstrate that memory is not a static life, it's a hard drive, but a dynamic and active process of social communication. From this aspect of the collective memory and social representation theory, taking in the context of the land grabs and articulated with the peace process, we obtained some results regarding the coding. So we identify how there is the conflict escalation, the external actors, the displacement factors, the impacts of the conflict, the resource impact, and the social dynamics. So here we can observe that in conflict escalation, there is the competition, the displacement, the resources, the external actors. We also observe displacement, interventions, violence, while the displacement factors are connected with fears and survival. The impacts of the conflict connected with insecurity, fear, supervision, resource impact regarding insecurity, loss, and finally the social dynamic, which establish distrust, social bonds, and fear. And then we could obtain applying the Galton triangle, three forms of violence: the direct and structural and cultural violence. And regarding the direct violence, we observe how the forced displacement was a primary victimization act. The more than physical and psychological abuse, extortion, forced recruitment, sexual violence, confinement and restriction of movement, destruction of livelihood assaults. The structural violence was present also regarding the absence of states, the denials of collective land rights, the states endorsing extractive concessions complicity between security force and paramilitaries, the gender inequality, limiting women's life projects, and arriving to the cultural violence, armed groups, behavioral norms imposed by force, stigmatization of displaced communities, patriarchal machismo, cultural conflict, also the historical rise of ethnic contributions, the normalization of violence through impunity, and finally the lack of knowledge about the conflict causes. And regarding all the analysis, thanks to Galton's theory, we arrived to eco-violence, in which we observe the conflict escalation mechanisms, in which, in a general way, we can identify the self-reinforcing cycle between natural resource wealth, armed group, and wait, civilian displacement, intensify extraction, that I think is very relevant to mention that. So regarding the collective memory findings, as I mentioned, so before the armed conflict, peaceful community-centered life organized around artisanal mining, fishing, and patron saint festivals, women held economic roles compared to men. During the conflict, there was a total confinement as a survival strategy. So rivers in this case becomes contaminated actually because the logging and extraction of different natural resources were playing a very strong role on those territories in which the communities were located. Economic activities halted, armed groups imposed military regime. All narrators, men and women, consider themselves victims of direct and physical, psychological, or verbal violence. After the armed conflict, persists fears of recurrence. So here the emotional part, the psychological aspect is very relevant, community fragmentation. Acoso community displaced to Buenos Aires, Condoto, and this is one of the main points here when we are talking about mobility. Basuru, in this case, is still under armed group presence, but they didn't displace, so they remains immobile. Finally, the two communities, we can see here how Basuru connected with immobility. For instance, we can see through the timeline how all the facing part of the fairs regarding the different armed groups which were involved during that time on those territories, established the two mass displacements actually of this community, but they continues on the territory. So some of members of these communities displaced, but in the same way, they try to continue returning to the place and to try to build a life on those conditions. The ACOSO regarding the mobility, which is connected with Condoto municipality, we can see how it was from 2000 to today that there were two displacements. And thanks to these efforts of them, they try to bring the possibility to continue living. But when they arrive to the municipality, the urban municipality, because they couldn't return to the communities and these territories were yeah, connected with the living of different armed groups on those areas. So they face very strong situations to try to live with better conditions. So finally, I want to mention uh, for ending my presentation how ecoviolence is one of the main escalation drivers in Chocó as a resource-rich territory, how the communities were targeted for disposition in service of an enclaved economic model. The collective memory is strong, but lacks structural explanatory knowledge. In 2016, peace accords have not resolved the conflict. As we know, we are still working in this situation on how the reactivation of the violence occurs. The stable peace requires full knowledge of the conflict cause, actors' equality, and comprehensive about the conditions of the living of the members of the communities, how the eco-violence is not just a fight for the earth, it's a fight over history. And finally, how memory immobility and memory mobility nexus is relevant for preserving the future through the past. So this research it has been not published, so it's actually in going process. I just wanted to clarify that I am trying to explain some of the preliminary findings that I could have regarding all these aspects that we have been analyzing. So I will end my presentation.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was really, really interesting, really deep and rich work there, and I'm looking forward to reading it as it develops. Now, our final paper for today is Adam's second paper. So I'll hand back over to Adam, who's presenting the paper, Climate Action in Displacement, Resilience, and the HDP Nexus.
Thank you, Tom. Let me just share my screen and get this full screen. Slideshow. Okay. Thanks again, everyone. In the second presentation, I will briefly present selected takeaways from research that we implemented between 2022 and 2025 as part of CGIAR's Fragility, Conflict, and Migration Research Initiative, which was a multi-year global research initiative. But the research presented today, or the methodology, was implemented in 3 settings, in Mozambique, in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh. I'm going to present just results from Pakistan and Bangladesh because we've already published several reports on these. What you're seeing now is sort of, we can call it a working paper. It's in the final stages of being shaped into a journal article. And so we'll present some selected takeaways from that research. And the research is called Climate Action in Displacement, Resilience, and the HDP Nexus. Slide. Great. And the main research question is, how can climate action interventions, through their effect on resilience, contribute to humanitarian development and peace-building outcomes in displacement contexts? And to explore this question, we worked on, like I said, 3 case studies really, but this will focus on 2. One which featured protracted displacement, and the other repeated displacement. So on the left, you have a few photos from UNHCR's SOMER, or Sustainable Land Management and Ecosystem Restoration Intervention in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. And this was an ecosystem restoration intervention that was implemented in camps 1W and 2W of the Kutupalong mega camp in Ukia, Cox's Bazar, where obviously there are many Rohingya refugees who have been displaced from Myanmar due to the conflict. And the objectives of this intervention were primarily around disaster risk reduction, and it especially focused on reducing flooding across the waterways of the across the banks of the Shomarjiri waterway, which runs through these camps. And essentially every time it would rain, the Shomarjiri would overflow and flood not just the households immediately along the stream banks, but many even uphill, and it would contribute to landslides and lots of other knock-on negative effects. And so the intervention really sought to reduce pollution in the waterway, to improve water flow, and to increase vegetation, tree density, biodiversity in this area, because anyone who's been to the camps will know it's not the greenest place. And then finally, there was an improved social cohesion objective, where the intervention sought to sort of improve relations between host and refugee communities. And the intervention consisted of community engagement and awareness raising, where UNHCR and local partners went house to house, sort of trying to understand what the situation was at the household level within the communities. It also involved the relocation of 39 households, which were located immediately along the stream banks and persistently flooded. There was the development of wash facilities, learning centers. There was also solid waste collection activities and slope protection, stream bank reinforcement, and the implantation of geotextiles and bamboo, again, to clear the waterway and to reinforce its banks and sides. There were also the construction of concrete walkways along the stream, because before that, it was sort of just like these dirt paths that would periodically collapse into the water. And there was a significant plantation campaign of vegetation and kitchen gardens along the stream bank. And there were solar streetlights that were constructed as well to improve nighttime lighting. And now on the right, you'll see some photos from an IOM intervention in Sindh, Pakistan. And this was implemented by IOM and local partners from 2024 to 2026. It's almost finished now. And more specifically, it was 44 villages in Sindh, where the 2022 floods essentially destroyed all structures and displaced all households. We did data collection in around 20 villages near Mirpakhas, and that data collection involved treatment and control groups, and I'll get back into the methodology in the next slide a little bit more. But the objectives of this intervention were to rebuild these individual shelters and communal settlements that were wiped out by the 2022 floods, to construct new wash infrastructure, and to also develop community infrastructure in some places. And so the components involved village and household level needs assessments, the formation of village committees to implement community action planning. And these committees were sort of the main interface between IOM and the communities. There was also the formation of WASH committees to coordinate and maintain WASH aspects of the intervention. And while these were meant to be sort of gender balanced, in practice, the WASH committees wound up being more women. There was the physical construction of new individual shelters that were made from improved materials and constructed according to 4 different designs with different quality and materials, and also according to different vernacular building styles. There was the construction of wash infrastructure, including pour flush latrines and hand-powered water pumps. And in 4 villages, there was additional community infrastructure that was built, mainly access roads and pathways. There was not enough funding to implement the community infrastructure construction in all villages. So again, this was in only 4 of the 44. And some of the key concepts that we were dealing with when sort of looking at these cases were around resilience, agency, HDP outcomes. And so you can see on the right that we developed this framework for assessing the impact of climate action interventions on resilience and HDP outcomes. And what you see here is that HDP outcomes and household resilience in the middle are related, and they are assumed to generally correlate, but it's not a direct correlation. And they're both impacted by many outside variables within the social ecological system, where you have climate hazards on the one hand and climate action interventions on the other, and where climate action interventions are effectively implemented, and we know that they're not always effectively implemented, and in some cases can lead to maladaptation, but where they are effectively implemented, they're assumed to some extent offset the negative impacts of climate hazards. And nested within all of this, you have structural factors. So the historical, political, social, economic, and environmental variables that shape household agency and then filter down to resilience and HDP outcomes. When we talk about resilience, we developed sort of our own definition, which we call informally Sendai Plus, because it is based on the Sendai frameworks definition where you have different moments of resilience. So anticipating a hazard before it occurs, withstanding a hazard as it occurs, and recovering from a hazard after it occurs. But we've added in this element of transformative adaptation, which is really more of a system level structural change that addresses the inequalities that drive vulnerability in an area. And in these sort of contexts where you have protracted or repeated displacement, we don't expect to see a lot of transformative adaptation come from these climate action interventions, but we included it because we thought it was a good benchmark to have in assessing their efficacy at their stated gains. And then moving into the methods, it was mixed method research. So we did literature and internal document review to sort of understand the objectives and the strategies that were laid out by the agencies themselves. We did quantitative risk mapping of current and projected hazards. So we did a baseline assessment of 1980 to 2010, and then we did a future projection of 2030 to 2050, which we average out to by 2040 of hazard exposure on these geographic areas. And so we look at drought, flood, and heat, and we look at the current risk levels and how they're likely to evolve over time. And then we also look at compound hazard, because as we know, when hazards increase in severity, frequency, or begin to overlap, then the compound effects are much worse than these hazards happening on their own. So we also forecasted that a little bit. And then we did medium scale quantitative surveys on perceived improvements to household resilience. So these are sample sizes of approximately 500 households in each setting with treatment and control groups, where we really went to households and we wanted to look at really subjective resilience. So this isn't an impact assessment where we had a before and after longitudinal data collection, but we really wanted to understand how households, felt that these interventions affected their resilience, because the lived experiences and the perceptions of the households are just as important as sort of quantitative measures of resilience. We also did lots of key informant interviews on the supply side with key stakeholders from the agencies, government agencies, community leaders, and then also demand side. So these are the actual households that are meant to be involved in and benefit from the interventions. And we were on site doing between 3 and 4 weeks of field observation in each of these contexts, really trying to understand with our own eyes and ears the social ecological implementation context and to see what was going on the ground. And we have lots of results from this, too many here, too many in general, but here we have some selected results. And what we tried to do is look at 2 of the cases on their own. So on the left, you have UNHCR Bangladesh, and on the right, you have Iowa and Pakistan. And then in the middle, you have common outcomes that we saw across both, where maybe we can draw some internal and perhaps external validity from these results in these 2 cases, but also, again, in these sorts of interventions in these types of contexts more generally. So I'll begin with the common outcomes and then move to the corners. So in both places, the majority of households reported significant improvements in household resilience, especially withstanding and recovering. We saw generally higher resilience gains for larger households, and improved shelter durability facilitated improvements in environmental security, which on its face is relatively, what you expect to see here. But we really thought it was interesting because environmental security then rippled out to other aspects of human security. Now, on the right, in Pakistan, you saw women make significantly higher gains in resilience, or report higher gains in resilience outcomes, I should say, than men. And this is really due to the wash infrastructure, which provided them with improved hygiene and privacy. And there were trainings around wash that the women really appreciated as well. And then on the left, like I said before, you saw this enhanced environmental security directly mitigate the flood-related risks, so reduce exposure to waterborne and zoonotic diseases. But then you also saw improved mobility and greater environmental awareness sort of result from this. And so I should say also that we've broadly divided the results here into the humanitarian development and peace building categories. And so as we move down to this center box on the development side in the common column, like I said, the environmental security that came from these interventions was notable for the humanitarian and direct impacts on household safety. But we also saw that it strengthened economic security in ways that were surprising. So you saw more household savings, because when households don't have to constantly repair themselves or replace damaged items, they can put that money into other forms of investment or save it. You saw more time for income generating activities, as households that were under threat of hazard felt more able and safe to leave the house for extended periods of time, travel further from home, stay away from home longer in order to sell their goods for more money. So that was important and something that we did see across cases. And then on the Pakistan side, in the development category, we saw these WASH committees that I mentioned before really provide women with incremental leadership opportunities that the women really, really appreciated. And on the more general side, with the village committees, which again were the main interface between IOM and the communities, these village committees were given, excuse me, sort of decision making and budgetary power in some cases, and this input in investment decisions really improved the household's sense of ownership and renewed place attachment to these areas. And there was sort of an empowerment, feeling of empowerment, I should say, that came through quite clearly here and was appreciated by the households. On the SOMA side, sorry, UNHCR Bangladesh, most of the labor involved in the intervention was provided by households through cash for work opportunities. And of course, in a place like Cox's Bazar, where households can't work, this was really, really appreciated. Kitchen gardens were also really appreciated and allowed for small scale production. And again, there was this improved place attachment. And then I'll keep on the Bangladesh side, moving down to peace building. These benefits on the development side were greatly appreciated by households, but they were unequally distributed. And this led to some intra-communal tensions, which UNHCR was not expecting and which needed to be addressed. So you saw improved waterway flow, again, as solid waste was cleared from the waterway. The flow of water through the Shomar increased, and this led to sand mining downstream, or sand accumulating in the stream. And this sand mining led to disputes between people sand mining and between those sand mining and the households adjacent to it. So this is something to manage. And then also there was some results around the role of the Majis, who are these installed community leaders that don't actually really represent the community's well-being in many circumstances. And in some cases where the supply of cash for work or kitchen gardens sort of didn't meet the demand of the households, then the Majis were brought in to sort of delegate who received what. And this sort of propped them up as power brokers in the communities, and was not excellent, we can say. And then on the Sindh Pakistan side, you didn't have, because whole villages were reconstructed here, and the benefits of the intervention were more equally and universally distributed, you didn't see this tension between participants and non-participants. So, this is something that you see in area-based humanitarian approaches more equally, and that's why I think a lot of agencies are shifting toward this modality. And then finally, there were these committees, again, the WASH committees and the village committees, which I spoke about before, which had a really positive impact on intra-communal collaboration and resource sharing that carried on even after the intervention. And then I think I'm over time, so I'm just going to quickly go through the programming implications of this. So, I mean, in these very sort of protracted or repeated displacement contexts, climate action interventions really have limited opportunities to support transformative adaptation. But there are areas within the margins where they can support other forms of resilience, which then ripple out through the HDP nexus. So we know that working communities is more powerful than working for communities. So this co-development and co-production that I think all the presenters have discussed today. By ensuring diverse community members are represented in the interventions, you can increase agency. We see these pluralistic communities that were really implemented in Pakistan were very useful for this and can potentially support political organizing and political engagement even after these interventions end. But these committees need to have actual decision-making power over investment and intervention design decisions. And there's also a real opportunity here that was a bit of a white space for these climate action interventions to more explicitly support land-based livelihoods, and more broadly, just to be linked with economic, political, and social aims. Resilience is not strictly an environmental variable, and when we look at more holistic impacts of it, then I think it can have a greater effect on the communities. And I will finish there, but happy to discuss more in Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. A second fascinating paper. And thank you to all of our presenters for a very captivating set of papers. I'm really looking forward to now unpacking them a bit further in our Q&A. So that's an invitation to everyone who's joining us online to please start populating the Q&A box. I haven't seen any come in so far, but hopefully you're all kind of letting them percolate and send them through. While we wait, I've got a couple of questions maybe I'll put to the panel, and maybe we'll do a round of responses and then we'll see where we go from there. My one of the things I've noticed across all of your papers is these ideas of mobility and immobility. They show up as adaptation, they show up as coping, and they show up as harms, often simultaneously. So I wanted to ask how, in your work, how do you decide when movement reflects agency versus when it reflects a loss of options? I'll open that up to anyone on the panel. Maybe we can go through.
I mean, we can start and then
Yeah.
happy for anyone to add in there. I think like the whole point of our presentation is trying to say that we need to understand migration as mobility outcomes that are differentiated, right? Because like in our data we see like a spectrum. Like you have the pastoralists, for example, who are moving yeah, in like the traditional way, because like pastoralism itself, like an embedded knowledge is that you move with your herds to like different water points, different grazing areas, and so on. So that mobility itself, kind of you could say that's like embedded in the practice. So they have agency to decide where you want to go. But with these like conflict, aid reduction, climate pressures, they're kind of forced out of that habituated response, how you usually cope with drought, right? So when they use language in the interviews like, oh, we were forced to go and live in the IDP camp. We actually just want to continue pastoralism, but we can't. Like when this language of like force and the circumstances kind of don't give you a choice, I would say that's obviously like not like you don't really have the agency anymore to decide what you want to do. So I think it's about like figuring out what are the aspirations, why are people landing in these different mobility outcomes, and through understanding the process and the why and the aspirations, you can then differentiate what is like a forced displacement outcome and what is more of a aspirational one. Anything you want to add?
Absolutely. So all great points, Maureen. I think I would just add maybe that agency itself is a spectrum, right? So I mean, in every instance, agency is constrained by whatever circumstances exist in obviously in everyone's lives, not only just in our clients' lives or people that are facing displacement or what have you. But again, so agency is always constrained. But I think when migration becomes like a forced question, or it's like a forced displacement, it's like really when you no longer have any options. So when your hand is forced. So I would say that this is like the most dire extreme end of that spectrum, where all of your options have now collapsed and you are really forced to move, as opposed to perhaps you would have preferred other options, but you're still exercising agency given the circumstances. You're still choosing to navigate as best you can, if that makes sense.
Excellent, thanks. Either of our other panelists want to chip in on that one?
I can jump in quickly, but I agree. I think those are strong comments, and sort of the idea that households always have some level of agency, even in very extreme levels of hazard or risk or violence. And there's interesting research that's come out of several contexts where you have these examples of very extreme violence that we would think makes anyone flee to a new place for safety, but then households often shelter in place. You have these amazing stories of heroism that come out, and of households supporting one another and staying in places that logic and a lot of the frameworks that are developed around aspiration and capacities would say, well, no, people should leave. And you see this again in sort of the immobility literature, where places that have been deemed unlivable due to sea level rise or other hazards that are in some places literally taking the land away, people do stay, and they find new ways of finding meaning, and they reshape how they relate to these social ecological systems in very surprising and interesting ways. And so everything is spectral. There's always some loss of options. There's always some agency that's exercised. And I think that really focusing on the nuance and rather than trying to create binaries is really useful in taking the sort of the climate mobilities literature forward.
Yes, in my case, I agree with that. And the other two colleagues, Ms. Marie and the other colleague. I think when we are talking about mobility and immobility, and in the conditions of for instance, post settings, peace building aspects, I think is very relevant when we analyze each case regarding how is important the analysis of the agency. So there, in both cases, we can see how the creation of the agency is done. So when I was speaking about Colombia, we can observe how depending on the territory, not just the Pacific region, so in different territories in Colombia, which different communities face the long-arm conflict, they could look into different forms of resistance, but also different forms of survival. So they create different strategies, and actually they brought like the possibility of in a psychological way, actually confronting themselves. And actually, when we speak with them, they say how it is important to look into other kind of forms of leveling what they face, right? So most of them say in this moment say we don't like that the people can say that we are victims of the conflict. We are more the survivors of the conflict. So when this kind of aspects of differentiation between the people who have faced these kind of very strong situations of violence, we identify how they have been developing different strategies that establish the agency in different forms. So I agree with Adam when he was mentioned that.
Great. Thank you. I think I've got our first question from our viewers. So the question here is, what advice would you have for countries like Canada where forest fires lead to significant displacement of Indigenous populations? And maybe we can talk about that in a little bit of a wider context, maybe the impacts of these environmental changes as a result of climate change on Indigenous communities. What advice would you have for countries facing those challenges? Adam, I think it was your paper mentioned something about this, so maybe you might be best placed to start.
Yeah, I saw this coming my way, and I will preface by saying I do not know much about Indigenous populations in Canada specifically, or the Canadian social political context. But I would say that more generally, these really interesting concepts that I discussed before, anti-displacement and re-emplacement, are being sort of held up as ways forward in places where communities have these really deep ontological connections to a specific place and have this quandary because they don't want to leave, but the place and the environment as it's always existed is now changing very, very rapidly, and such sort of degrading the place attachment that these communities have. And so what do you do here? Um, lots of places are responding with relocation campaigns to try to support these households and communities to move to safer places, which from a pure sort of environmental security aspect, okay, you reduce the environmental risk. But again, if this sort of jeopardizes someone's whole sense of meaning and what their life and community has meant for a very long time, this may not be the optimal response here. So I would say, first of all, working with these communities is, of course, the most important thing, and understanding what they want. Agency is inherent, and believe me, if you go and speak to people, of course, they will tell you what they would like. If there are various outcomes here, and designing the solutions with the communities is the most important part. But I think, and again, I don't know a lot about forest fires in Canada specifically, but there are ways in which, and this is where the re-emplacement comes in. Anti-displacement is really trying to resist displacement by moving people or matter or practices and redefining them. Re-emplacement is more about having a new sort of sense of place in an area. So redefining what it means to be from this area. And this is something that maybe is very useful in areas where you have forest fires, sort of finding new practices and ways of connecting with changed lands that could be useful here. And I think there's probably a hybrid approach where people who sort of want to leave can be supported to leave. People who want to stay can be supported to stay and to reimagine what life is like in these rapidly shifting environments.
Thanks, Adam. Do any of our other panelists want to add in any thoughts? Otherwise, there has been another question that's come through.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly like add a few things. I think like on
Mm,
a very high level, what still tends to happen is that kind of conflict and climate are often still seen as separate when you look at governments. And I also don't know so much about Canada and like the specific environment there, but they tend to be like quite siloed and not seen as like stressors that reinforce each other. So I think like first of all, recognizing that climate and conflict are kind of like a nexus and reinforcing each other is like the first part. And then again, I feel like a lot of governments and a lot of NGOs or other organizations still rely a lot on quantitative data. And I'm not saying that quantitative data is not important, it's really important, but still to understand the process, the why, like really co-creating knowledge with communities to understand their lived experience of what it means to live in this place, like how they're already adapting to those conditions, because it's often like a top-down definition of, oh, communities should do this. This is like a great adaptation practice, and this is maladaptation. It's like kind of top-down defined, and then they're like imposing these quantitative metrics of this is good adaptation to wildfires in that case, but really going in and like talking to communities also qualitatively to understand the process of it and what the meanings of this place, the livelihood, whatever is really important. So yeah, that we don't create any top-down interventions that in the end misfire.
excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
As a qualitative researcher, I couldn't agree more. Stephanie, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to mention that always when we are talking about what are the implications of the implementation of different policy frameworks, it's relevant to understand the top-down approaches that always are taking place. But here, when we are talking about the displacement of indigenous populations, it's always like how are the local communities facing and how the voices of them requires to be a priority, like a possibility of establishing a bottom-up approaches that is permit different solutions that bring actually connected with climate change, actually.
Great, thank you. So we do have another question here from Natalie Bodine. And so she writes, "Hi, thank you so much for each of your presentations. My question is for anyone on the panel, but may best apply to Adam's research. How does state capacity and political inclusion of vulnerable communities factor into the uneven distribution of foreign assistance?" Adam, since you were mentioned by name, we'll start with you, but then we'll open up for the full panel.
Sure, thanks. The short answer is I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it factors into uneven distribution of foreign assistance, but I think that um, you have sort of where you have protracted or repeated displacement, it's often because of very limited state capacity or the political exclusion of certain groups, and it's the vulnerability that these sort of variables lead to that allows displacement or immobility or any of these, let's say, negative mobility outcomes or a lack of agency to occur. Um, and when you bring foreign assistance into the equation, I guess through the lens of the UN interventions, obviously the UN or INGOs often need to work with the state to deliver humanitarian development or peace building interventions. And so then it becomes a little bit tricky because if you're working with communities that have been purposefully excluded by political or economic processes, how do you work with those excluding them to bring them back in? And I think that most UN agencies or INGOs probably don't really want to get directly into this because it sort of limits your ability to act in a humanitarian or a non-partial manner in these contexts and can risk you being able to work there at all. So I think that the answer then is that working directly with communities to sort of focus on development as a process becomes really important. And again, we saw this in Pakistan a little bit, where IOM really was very successful at helping communities sort of establish these committees. It was very interesting. The communities really liked it. And even though they were in the beginning really only able to exercise agency over some limited aspects of the intervention, the communities then sort of went a little bit further and were like, well, what if we keep these committees after the intervention is over and the funding is done? And they became actual institutions within the communities going forward. And with a little bit more funding and a little bit more time, you could see how these committees that were formed as part of this intervention, so in a very top-down manner, could outlast the intervention and begin looking at political mobilization or resource sharing or conflict mitigation or disaster risk reduction. There's lots of different ways in which, with a bit of capacity sharing and funding, these committees could then become agencies of development. And development, and I don't want to get into development theory here, but obviously development is seen by many as a process, and that the process of sort of determining what you want and going for it is as important as achieving those outcomes. So that's what I would say to that.
Great, thank you. Any of our other panelists want to jump in on that one?
Absolutely. I fully agree with what Adam said. And also wanted to add something that we find a lot, particularly when it comes to climate finance, for example, is that a lot of the times the most vulnerable countries, particularly the ones, let's say, in which our team at IRC works, like looking at countries in fragile and conflict affected settings, they typically receive the least amount of assistance for climate finance, for ecological questions, and so forth. And sort of the logic of donors and the logic of like even multilaterals in many instances, particularly when it comes to, let's say, non-emergency humanitarian aid. So things like climate or ecological questions are often considered development questions. So even multilaterals and other donors are a bit hesitant to fund a lot of these states because of this perceived lack of state capacity. In some instances, also the political exclusion of vulnerable communities, which of course does happen and which is harder to mitigate in active conflict zones, for example. So it sort of perpetuates the cycle, right? On the one hand, these countries that are most vulnerable are often receiving the least assistance. Of course, there are many reasonable qualms about, inclusion or lack thereof in these cases. Perhaps even many valid qualms about or concerns about state capacity, potentially corruption, and so forth. But then what do we do? How do we bridge this gap, right? Because we can't say, well, as a donor, a funding institution, well, we don't want to fund this country because of corruption or because of whatever. If they do still have these immediate needs that need to be met, or these perhaps long-term risks from climate change or what have you. So it's quite a sticky situation, and I think one that's not fully been resolved, at least in the climate space. And there are, of course, many other questions that sort of factor into this. Is it a humanitarian or a development question? Because climate sort of sits in the in-between. But all of this to say that we find that it very much affects the distribution of foreign assistance, particularly when it comes to more ecological questions and less sort of immediate life-saving aid. So I hope that answers your question, Natalie.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, did you have anything to add or? No? Oh, good. I think we've got time for one final question from me. So I think it's quite interesting. All of you inhabit this place where you're I think I'm correct in saying that all four of you are doing PhDs currently, but you also all work in some form of practitioner world and kind of inhabit the two sides of what we know as environmental peace building. So I was wondering, putting on the kind of, I always kind of think of the academic side having a little bit more freedom away from the kind of institutional assumptions that we have in the practitioner world. So I wonder if you could challenge one assumption that policymakers or practitioners currently hold about climate mobility and conflict based on your academic work or other work. What would it be? And we've got 4 minutes, so it's about time for a 1 minute answer each. And whoever wants to go first, Stephanie, you can go. Yeah.
No, can you repeat again the question?
So if you could change one assumption that policymakers or practitioners currently hold about climate mobility and conflict, what would it be?
I can start.
Yep.
So I come from the behavioral science or psychological science background and kind of economics. And one assumption that I'm trying to question with my whole PhD is that communities are not reacting irrational. They're not biased. They're not having like irrational, maladaptive answers to pressures of conflict and climate. So I kind of want to change this narrative of this top-down definition of this is irrational, this is rational, people are not like you can't have the spanning of rational irrational there. It's not like an economic actor that's doing like these calculations in their head. So trying to move away from that and understanding the process and the why behind it is one of the big themes of my academic maybe career. Let's see.
Great. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think this covers a lot of my perspectives as well. So perhaps in the interest of time, let's move on to the others.
Cool. Okay, all good. Adam, maybe, and then we'll go to Stephanie.
Interesting question, Tom. I think for me, I would challenge the assumption that any of these outcomes in terms of mobility, humanitarian development, or peace building outcomes are inevitable. It's often assumed by practitioners and researchers that because you have extreme hazards in this place, people are going to be displaced, or people aren't going to be able to move, or because you have climate-related resource depletion, you're going to have conflict. And the more research is done on this, the more we see diverse outcomes, and the more we see they're shaped by local, political, environmental, social variables. And where resources are under strain, as often as you'll see conflict, I think more often you'll see households and communities coming together to support one another. And that's really interesting work that we've seen in some of our more climate security-related research. The same with mobility outcomes. As I've said, there are a lot of places that it's assumed that climate change is going to happen. It's going to continue increasing in its impacts, and that communities are going to have to move. They're not going to be able to stay in these places. And we're seeing communities themselves really redefine what it's like to stay in these places and find new forms of meaning and forms of mobility emerging here. So I think just embracing this nuance and not, as researchers or practitioners, assuming that because you have a certain process, you're going to have a certain outcome.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adam. And lastly, Stephanie, I think we've got about 30 seconds. So sorry to put you under time
Yes.
pressure.
No, don't worry. No, I will agree with all. So I think this is one of the challenges. So in my case, as I have been working in peace building processes, focus on raising the voices of local communities, focus more in the local peace. So in that sense, I think one of the challenges that they really implement approaches that bring into consideration the voices of them, because sometimes we can observe that they create the interventions, taking some of the ideas, bringing from them, but actually we observe that it's like forms of the manipulation that they can have regarding the possibility of asymmetrics of power and of what that means. So on that sense, I agree that it's necessary to bring into consideration more bottom-up approaches, and doing research in academic sector is one of the main points here that I think is very relevant.
Wonderful. Thank you. And a great note to end on. So this brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you once again to our speakers for sharing their work, and to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association for creating this space where we can share and engage with each other like this. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining. I hope you've all enjoyed the session. For those heading to Ottawa next week, safe travels. I'm very jealous. For everyone else, enjoy the rest of the virtual day or the rest of your afternoon or evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks so much,
Thanks, everyone.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.